G'day and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video, I want to cover a really common misconception that I see day to day about shoulder posture and what your best shoulder posture might actually be. Now, one of the things that we see a lot is when we're talking about how to find your best posture, the common wording that we tend to use is making sure that your shoulders go back and down. But what I want to cover in this video today is I want to talk about why that may not necessarily be the best thing for us to do, and why the best thing for us to do might actually be somewhat opposite to what we're doing. So the first thing I wanted to talk about here is I want to talk about how we've arrived at the point where shoulders back and down has intuitively been the go-to postural phrasing for better posture. Generally, this comes from a really simple idea, is that a lot of people tend to pull their shoulders down because we're trying to combat tight upper back and neck muscles. And the idea behind this is that if we are tight, whether that be through stress or whatever reason, then we're trying to pull those shoulders back down again to encourage and stretch that tissue to give. But what I tend to find clinically is that that idea tends to miss the point a little bit. And if we take a small step back and get a little bit of a broader perspective, we may actually see that there's a bigger cause for that upper sort of trap, that neck, shoulder, upper back tightness, that may actually be the opposite to what we've been thinking about for a long time. And in order to explore this in a little bit more detail, we just need to see clearly what tends to happen when we lose good posture. Because after all we're trying to do with the shoulders back and down position is achieve better postural positioning or better shaping of our tissue, hopefully decrease the risk of developing stiffness, tightness, dysfunction, and potentially pain down the track. So what we tend to see is that we know that from a good posture, if we tend to slouch, what tends to happen with gravity and with the orientation of our tissue is that tissue tends to drop and roll forwards amongst a bunch of other stuff that goes on, whether it's the neck or the upper back sort of rounding off as well. But the point I wanted to make here is that the natural way that we tend to lose good posture is by dropping our shoulders down and forwards. So in the spirit of trying to reclaim good posture, if we're trying to go back and then down, we're potentially doing half of a good job. We're definitely taking our shoulders back like we should, but if they've already dropped through the weight of the arms and through the force of gravity, then going back and down further is potentially going to be disadvantageous to anyone that's dealing with some postural related dysfunction through that neck. So what I find clinically and what I urge my patients to do clinically is instead of going back and down, we actually want them to come back and up slightly. And again, what I tend to find clinically is the reason why these muscles get tight in the first place. When we're looking at this chicken or the egg scenario, muscles don't get tight and dysfunctional on their own. They do so at the request of your brain and nervous system in order to protect or support something. So if a tissue has become tight, it doesn't magically become tight because we're holding our shoulders up. What tends to happen, or at least what I see tends to happen, is because our shoulders are dropping and rolling forwards, there's a constant weight or a constant pull going through the base of the neck, the upper back, and the shoulder tissue just from being in that shape. So what we need to try and understand here is that a lot of the upper trap tightness or a lot of the stiffness and tightness in this area is generally a consequence of being in a bad position. We're not necessarily in a bad position because we're tight, but getting into a bad position and forgetting about that over a long period of time tends to request the areas that get loaded up differently to become stiff, tight, and restricted to cope with that shape, to adapt to that position. So again, when we're trying to understand why we're doing something and what's the optimal version of ourselves, we know that if we're up in a good posture and we drop and roll forwards through gravity, logically and intuitively, we need to come back and up a little bit more to make that more posturally friendly and more optimal. So if you're someone who is experiencing some aches and pains or some dysfunction and you've been told that your posture isn't necessarily good enough or the shapes that you're getting into isn't necessarily good enough, instead of going backwards and down, just try going backwards and up for a little bit to make sure you take the tension out of that area, to give that area a chance to recover and to decrease that restriction and restore some normality in terms of function. And I think you'd be pleasantly surprised that a lot of the stiffness and tightness that may have been hanging around for a while may start to decrease over time if you're consistently out of the shapes and the positions and the loading patterns that are asking that tissue to be tight in the first place. Now, I did a video a couple of weeks ago on sort of a shoulder postural taping technique. I'll leave the link around here somewhere in the description and also up in the corner here, just so that you can hopefully see a way that you can respectfully force yourself into a better position if you're trying to get rid of that extra tightness and stiffness a little bit faster. But the other thing that's really important to cover here is that we tend to link stress in amongst this type of conversation. A lot of people tend to say that they carry a lot of stress and tension in their shoulders, which again, they're always up into this position, which again perpetuates the reason for why they're trying to pull those shoulders back down again. But what I tend to find clinically is, in terms of stress for all intents and purposes isn't necessarily a good or a bad thing. It's just a thing. It's a stimulus that prompts our tissue to react a certain way. And what it does is, stress is a whole body experience. So if you feel genuinely stressed, it's not so much that you carry the stress and tension in your shoulders, but it can expose some generally hidden underlying dysfunction that may already be there. So if you are someone who tends to sit at your desk, you get a little bit slouchy, or if you're in that sort of mouse position where you're very asymmetrical and really pulling and increasing the load through that neck and shoulder, and you feel stressed on top of that, it's very likely that your muscular tightness and the stiffness in the area may be greater than someone who isn't stressed, because your body is reacting to the excess load in that area more severely than it would as if you weren't stressed. So it's really important to understand that if you do blame stress or feel like stress plays a huge role in your sort of upper trap or neck and upper back dysfunction, it's unlikely to be the cause of that dysfunction. But what should happen is, if you can get yourself back into a better shoulder position and away from the downward shape that a lot of people pull themselves into, you might be able to rejig the tension in the area, take away the reason for the stiffness and tightness there, irrespective of any stress, and then hopefully any aches, pains, or dysfunctions that you feel that might be associated with that sort of altered loading now has a chance to go away and stay away long term. And if you genuinely found that useful, let me know in the comments down below if you are someone who has always thought that way, and let me know whether just that subtle tweak of, instead of going down, coming up a little bit, has changed your perception or how your issues may feel day to day. And if you did find that helpful, please consider leaving a like rating on the video, please consider subscribing to the channel if you're new, and please consider leaving a super thanks donation on the video if you did find this helpful and it helped maybe fill a gap that hadn't been filled for a long time. With that being said, thank you for watching once again, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.